First tonight, Ghana has become the first country to approve a new vaccine for malaria that researchers are calling a world changer in the battle against the virus that is one of the leading killers of children in Africa. The vaccine, called R21, appears effective compared to previous trials. It's been approved for use on children aged between 5 months and 3 years. The World Health Organization is also considering approving the vaccine, which was first developed by Oxford University in the UK. Malaria kills about 620,000 people each year, many of them young children in Africa. The Serum Institute of India is preparing to produce between 100 to 200 million doses per year, with a vaccine factory being constructed in Ghana's capital, Accra. Each dose of R21 is expected to cost at least a couple of dollars. Some have said about $3 or so. Well, for more on this, let's bring in our Rise correspondent, Laurie Laird, who joins me from London. Good to see you, Laurie. So the vaccinologists in Britain, where you are, describing this malaria vaccine as a world changer and a turning point. Tell us more about its effectiveness.
Well, from what we know, Charles, and we're looking at data from what's called stage 2 trials, and the trial from which we're gleaning our data right now is the smallest trial, 400 young children between the ages of 5 months and 36 months, but we're seeing that the efficacy rate is somewhere between 75 and 80%, depending on how many doses these children are given. Now, that is well ahead of anything that we've seen before. There is a vaccine that's in distribution right now, developed by GSK. The efficacy rate of that vaccine is not nearly as high. Furthermore, there aren't that many doses of this GSK vaccine floating around. But if we go back to this GSK vaccine, the one that's already in existence, something that's rather extraordinary is that we're still seeing pilot programs for this GSK vaccine, pilot programs that have been going on since 2019. It is now 2023. And I think, Charles, that tells you something about the immediacy, the urgency that drug companies are finding a cure for malaria or a vaccination for malaria, i.e., they're not finding any degree of urgency to push this forward. And I think this is something we'll get to in this conversation, but I think that answers the question as to why Ghana felt that it had to act quickly and it had to act unilaterally.
Yeah, well, I want to push that point about Ghana because, I mean, the final phase of data is due later this year, but they've given regulators in countries like Ghana a sneak preview, and Ghana has decided to fast-track it. But it's quite unusual for an African country to approve a vaccine ahead of the World Health Organization, isn't it?
There's so many things that are unusual about this. This will be a test case in so many ways. Charles, as you say, unusual for an African country to approve a drug before a Western country. Unusual for a country to approve a drug before getting World Health Organization approval. And that's important for a number of reasons, mostly because multilateral organizations like Gavi, like UNICEF, tend not to pay for vaccinations that haven't been approved by the World Health Organization. But again, let's go back to the slow pace at which malaria vaccinations have been developed. And let's compare that with how we saw COVID vaccinations developed in under a year because so many rich world countries threw money at that. And you've got to wonder if whether Ghana is trying to get ahead of things. Well, for a couple of reasons. One reason is that vaccinations for malaria have been in development for decades with no real vaccination coming into fruition until a couple of years ago. The other is, I think, African nations, having suffered from COVID, having been at the back of the queue to get COVID vaccinations, are saying, wait a second, maybe it doesn't make sense to wait for all of the protocols from the multilateral organizations. Let's help ourselves here if we can.
Yeah, well, that seems reasonable. But of course, Laurie, the other problem is that although this is a low-cost vaccine, I mean, we're only talking about $2 or $3 per dose, it still needs to be funded. And there also needs to be infrastructure to roll it out. Do we have any of those details from the Ghanaian government?
Not a bit. We have lots of wonderful plans, mostly the Serum Institute of India saying that they are prepared to gear up to produce 100 to 200 million doses a year. And again, that is well below the kind of capacity we've seen for this GSK vaccination that is already in distribution, but doesn't seem to be as effective as this R21 developed by Oxford University. But again, funding tends not to come until you get WHO approval. Now, we've had a representative from Gavi. He's spoken to the press. He spoke to Reuters, and he said, hey, we're happy to fund this stuff, but we need World Health Organization approval, and we probably won't touch it unless it costs less than $3 a dose. And we don't have, we're hearing from the Ghanaian regulators, we're hearing from Oxford that the dosage of this one, the R21, will be a couple of dollars a dose. But of course, there's a difference between $2 a dose and $3 a dose and $4 a dose when it comes to these multilateral organizations funding these kinds of vaccinations. So a lot to learn yet about this vaccination. I think one thing that does sound very promising is in the early stage trials, the stage 2 trial, which again, only 400 children, but still this is the data that we are dealing with, that we haven't seen any sort of reports of side effects, of poor side effects. I think that is something that is very encouraging. And if there aren't adverse side effects, it certainly would be something that the World Health Organization could expedite World Health Organization approval. And I think the hope is that Ghana jumping the gun here may accelerate the approval coming from the World Health Organization and hence those other multilateral institutions.
Very interesting indeed. And this has been the holy grail of medicine for decades, to try to find a vaccine for malaria. Laurie, thank you very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Arise correspondent, talking to me from London.